so that you understand what this, who are the folks here on this call delivering this webinar? Jen, do you want to take a minute?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Avery. Thanks for putting this together tonight. And thanks everybody for joining us this evening. As Chris said, I'm Jennifer Harville, and I'm the projects director at the Tug Hill Commission in Watertown. And for those of you who don't know anything about us, the Tug Hill region covers about 2,100 square miles in portions of Jefferson, Lewis, Oneida, and Oswego counties. We're a very small, non-regulatory state agency that provides technical assistance to the towns and villages of Tug Hill in the program areas of land use planning, local governance, community and economic development, and natural resources. And one of the ways we deliver those services is through our circuit riders. And I see we have Mickey and Paul who are also joining, and my colleague John Helt is here with me to introduce himself and introduce us to how this concept got started and how we reached out to EFC to give us some help with this topic. So go ahead, John.
Thanks, Jen. As you said, I'm John Helt. I'm with the Tug Hill Commission, but more specifically, I am the Municipal Projects Coordinator with the Northern Oneida County Council of Governments. Basically, I work closely with the 17 towns and villages that make up NOCOG as a resource between those communities and the Tug Hill Commission. So basically, everybody knows that knowledge transfer is an important topic. It's often discussed, but unfortunately not much action follows the discussion. And the conversation, even though it's always been around, it kind of took some steam. And I always use the town of Lee as an example. A short while ago, their clerk of more than 20 years unexpectedly passed away. And she was in that position for so long, handling the day-to-day operations. When she wasn't there anymore, it really did put the town in a bind. They weren't prepared for it. Reports weren't filed. They didn't know passwords into certain computer programs. So here it is almost 2 years later, and they still are struggling trying to get caught back up. So when that happened, and the town of Lee is actually one of our NOCOG communities, it really struck a chord. So we started the conversation with Jen, who actually knew Chris had done some work on this in the past. And this is where we are today with that. So that's where we stand.
Great. Excuse me. Great. Thanks, John. And thanks, Jennifer. Let me just advance the slide. So if you have been living under a rock for the last 3 years and don't understand Zoom, here is a slide for Zoom logistics. So you can mute and unmute, start your video. If you want to ask a question, drop it in the chat. There will actually be an opportunity later in my presentation for you to actively put things in the chat so that we can actually have a little bit of a discussion. And then if you go to reactions, you can raise your hand. I will take your question. If you want to laugh at me, that's fine. If you want to clap, that's fine. But those are the reactions. And again, raising your hand, putting something in chat. We want this to be interactive, but we understand that we can't have everybody unmuted all at once. All right, so let's get started. Oh, actually, Avery, do you mind talking about this? The certificates?
Yeah, I'll just use your mic, Chris. So we will be sending out certificates after today's session. We only ask that you attend for the entire webinar and that you register and attend using your real name and unique email address so that we can get you the right certificate to the right place. So we'll be sending out certificates, and if you have any questions about those, you can email me at the email here on the screen. And then can you advance your slides, Chris? We will also be posting the slides from today and the recording on our website on the link here on the screen. But if you attended today's session, we'll also be emailing you as well. So be on the lookout for that. And I think we can get started.
Sounds good. Any questions from anybody so far logistically? All right. So knowledge transfer, right? Like Every day I go and I do things, and not everybody that I work with knows what I do. And if I left tomorrow, I'm not sure they would know what I did yesterday. But I also would not necessarily know what to tell them to do. And this is a really important thing when it comes to local governance, because when folks go away for one reason or the other, lost election, et cetera, we still need to get that daily work done. There are taxpayers who rely on us for the things that we do on the daily. And if we don't understand what our colleagues do, it puts us at a risk and it makes us vulnerable. And there are many case studies, for lack of a better term, of communities where someone's left and it has created havoc for the people who remain. And that havoc is not only stressful for the person who remains, but it's also inefficient, and it creates the taxpayers an expense that otherwise wouldn't have to be. So this is a quote from Donald Rumsfeld. Some of you may know who he is. Most of you may know who he is. The Secretary of Defense under G.W. Bush. There are known knowns, so we know what we know. There are things we know that we know. There are known unknowns, so there are things that we know that we don't know. But there are also things that are unknown unknowns. So like, we don't even know what we don't know. And that's the scary part. Like, do we know what the password is to that computer? Have we asked? These are the kinds of things to start thinking about when you want to look at not necessarily evaluating people and their position, but like, do we have redundancy in place in our utilities, in our highway department, in the clerk's office, so that if that person went away suddenly, we could step in and at least make through. And in some cases, we can't do that. And so that's why we're here today. Think about what keeps you up at night in your role as an elected official, as a highway superintendent, as a councilman, as a clerk. What keeps you up at night? And you can drop that in the chat if you want, and Avery will catch those and share them for us. I don't need for you to do that, but I want you to think about that question. What keeps you up at night when it comes to your job? And then how do we fix that? How do we get you to go to sleep more easily? Making sure that the information that's in your head or in someone else's head is written down somewhere. So at the end of the day, we're really talking about human capital management, which sounds wonky, but we've got people who work for us. We've got people who are elected to do a certain job. We've got people who are paid to do a certain job. And we need to understand what those roles are, who the people are that fill those roles today, and what skills are required to fill those roles. And they may not match up, and that's okay. So what roles do we need to be filled? What skills does that role require? And who do we have in place? And just starting there. And again, we're not trying to call people out. We're not trying to make people feel suspect about their job or threatened. But like, what do we need these people to do? And are they doing those things? If they are, great. If they're not, okay, can we get them to do that? And it may not necessarily be that they don't want to do it. It may be a capacity issue. Dude, you're asking me to do 60 hours of work in a 40-hour work week. I can't do that. All right, well, let's create a plan for additional capacity. But if we can start with what we know now, who we have working for us now, what they're doing, and what their skill set is, that's the basis for knowledge transfer. Designed to be worried about the 30-year-old who's been working for us for 5 years, who probably will work for us for another 25 years, than I am the guy who's worked for us for 25 years and has a retirement clock on his desk. And so you might want to plot out, this is just another way of looking at things. You could plot out how folks, how risky different positions are based on the people who are filling those positions. And so if you had 5 or 6 folks, you could plot them out on this 4-quadrant chart, right? The 25-year-old who's interested in working, he's eager, he wants to stay around, low risk. Impact, organizational impact, low, because he doesn't know a lot. He hasn't been around for a while. Probability of vacancy, also low, because he doesn't think he's going to go anywhere for a while. High risk, the guy who's been around for 30 years, who knows an awful lot, and he's been around for 30 years and he's looking to get out. And so you can start looking at where your people are on this chart and starting to think about what it is that they know, what's in their head, what skill sets they have that you might need to replicate somewhere else or develop in other people before they go. And again, stop me at any time with questions, comments. I will rattle on for the entire webinar, but I do want to offer you to interrupt. Another way to look at it: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. So you can look at things that are internal to the organization, lack of budget, difficulty in hiring, weak staff, strong staff, overly strong staff, and then the external origin. You have a great job out there, but you can't find recruits. Your tax base is dwindling and it's harder and harder to pay for the services that you provide. Things like that. Again, other ways to look at how you think about the services you provide, the folks you have in place, and how you retain the knowledge that you need to keep that ship running. So one part of that succession planning, passing the torch on to other people. This was a popular meme from a few years ago. It's not always my last day, but today is my last day. Today is not my last day, but people always leave, and you should always be planning for that. And whether they've been around for 30 years or 3, what is it that's in their head, and how are you capturing that knowledge? A quick note on succession planning. Excuse me. So succession planning is really looking at who you have, what skills, knowledge, and abilities that you need, what positions you have. So people, skills, positions, and then trying to figure out a way that all those 3 buckets line up to provide for the future. And then you do a gap analysis. So like, hey, we've got these guys who are doing this job, but we actually have these jobs and these skills that need to be met. And these folks don't fill those roles. And that's not too bad for them. It's not necessarily their fault. Maybe we can develop them up, provide training, support, or maybe we need to hire somebody new. And also, by the way, Joe is leaving, and he's got his retirement clock on his desk, and he's going to be gone in 2 or 3 years. So what are we doing to replace Joe? Is it Seth and Joni, who are younger, newer staff? Are we going to develop them up to replace Joe, or are we going to hire out from somewhere else? And also, what is the knowledge in Joe's head that we absolutely need to know when he goes? Where are the bodies buried? And these aren't easy conversations to have. And I'll show you in a little bit a tool that we've developed that hopefully will help you at least think about how to capture some of this knowledge. And for someone like me and my colleague Avery, if I was to leave this job tomorrow, there's an awful lot of things that she would want to know. And some of it's in my head, some of it is on my computer, and some of it I would need to talk to her about. So there are multiple ways to communicate the knowledge that we have. Those as-built maps that we have for our water and wastewater utilities are old and essentially non-functioning. So if I left today and I was a water operator for a utility and I gave somebody a map that was developed 40 years ago, that's not helpful. What's helpful is in my head, describing all of the changes that have taken place since that design was created. So anyway, succession planning, not people, roles, knowledge, skills, and abilities, assessing who we have, what roles we need, what skills we need, and what skills we have, and trying to marry those things together so that the folks who are in place can help us provide the service that we do for our community. And if there's a gap, we plan to fill it. And if folks leave, we've got a plan for what happens after they leave. All right, so knowledge transfer. Again, this is a difficult topic to discuss with folks because knowledge is both, oops, I'm sorry, I thought I had a slide there that I don't have. It's both implicit and explicit. So I could share with you the as-built drawings for a utility. That's explicit. As changes occur to that utility over years and they don't get written down, that's implicit. If a pump fails, I know who to call because that guy has been working with us for years. That's implicit. If I had that written down in my Rolodex, and some of you are old enough to know what a Rolodex is, then you would be able to access that. That would be explicit. So there are a lot of things in my head that I can't just pull out and put on paper without taking the time or without you asking me to take the time to figure that out and give that information to you. So really knowledge transfer is about that explicit information. And some of that is username and password. Where's the key to the locker? Where's the key to the file cabinet? What's the code to the front door? Who do you call when the alarm goes off? These kinds of things that some folks may know that others don't. And when those folks leave, you may actually need to know. If the alarm goes off and that person's gone and the alarm company is calling you and you don't have a code, well, that's awkward. So it's not about what you know, it's about what you should know. And knowledge is also power. People like to hold on to knowledge because it creates power. I may not want to tell my colleague Avery a bunch of things because it makes me feel more powerful because I know those things and she doesn't. And if I left and she didn't know those things, well, it would hurt our organization. And so you want to try to break down that power as much as possible. And speaking frankly, again, elected officials, power and knowledge is power. And we want to make sure that as much as possible, we can diffuse power. And I could talk all day long about how we diffuse power with elected officials, with meetings, but again, we're talking today about knowledge transfer. But knowledge is power, and people aren't often willing to give it up. Even if they're able, they're not willing. And the able part's a really big deal, and I'll get to that in a minute, where I could tell Avery everything I want to tell her so that she could do my job if I have left. But I'm not thinking of everything. And there are things in my inbox that I may not be remembering. And there may be passwords and people who I forget to pass along. So it takes time, it takes a plan, and it takes an equalization of power between the person who has the knowledge and the person who wants to get that knowledge. So I want to take a minute here, and if you want to drop in the chat, that's great. If you don't, that's fine too. If you want to unmute and share with us, that's fine also. Some people like to hear me talk all day, but I bet most of those folks aren't on this webinar. So if in the position that you're in now and where you are now, if you knew then when you started what you know now, or if you knew then what you don't know now, what are the known knowns? What are the unknown unknowns that you think you might have in your job? And again, you can share those verbally, unmute, or drop them in chat. I'm not going to make a thing of this. If folks don't have a lot to say, we can move on, but I am trying to engage folks so that we can have kind of a back and forth.
So it looks like someone just dropped in the chat.
So I guess, Stephen, I'm curious what industry you mean. And you can unmute and talk, or you can water, yeah. The drinking water industry is heavily regulated by the state vis-a-vis the EPA. And so there's a lot of things that are written down somewhere else, even if they're not at your utility, that you could access. So yeah, so for keeping data on assets, no, and that's a shame. So the state of New York is beginning to roll out pilot projects on asset management. So where the asphalt guy paved over a manhole and you didn't know it was there until flooding occurred and it erupted through the road, right? Like, we want to know what assets we have, what condition they're in. And an asset could be a hydrant, a manhole cover, a pump, a valve, an entire utility. We can define the level of asset that we want based on maybe monetary value. Anything that costs more than $500 is an asset. Or for a larger utility, anything that costs more than $5,000 might be an asset. But we create an asset management, an asset inventory, and then we create a plan for those assets based on condition, how old are they, how well are they working, and criticality. If it failed, how bad would that be? Yep, criticality, Steve. So we look at condition of the asset and then the criticality of it, and then the cost to replace, rehab, or repair. We can provide cheat sheets for contacts for state and federal funding agencies for sure. We have that, I think, actually at hand. And so Joanna, we can provide those things. So you know when you get into a bad position, who to call. And Paul, to your point, acronym soup, we can certainly, we do have a document that provides contact information for state and federal funding agencies and the acronyms that go with them. So maybe Avery, we can provide that as a follow-up to this webinar. And if I've misspoken, you can certainly correct me. So what else? If you didn't, what do you know today that you wish you knew then? When you got elected, when you took the job as water operator or highway superintendent or whatever? And here's some follow-up questions. Again, drop them in the chat, unmute and verbalize. Again, I'm just trying to engage folks. If you could go back in time, what advice would you give yourself? Who knows what and when are they leaving? If you're thinking about folks who are working with you, what do they know? And do you know when they're leaving? Do you know what their plan is? He could be 30 and he might be planning to move from Watertown to Buffalo and you don't know that. He could be 65 and you think he's retiring, but he stays around for another 10 years. So who are these folks? What do they know? And how are you capturing that information? And then if they do leave, are you worried about capacity? And if you left your job, what are the pieces of information that you would want folks to know right away? If you went on vacation next week, who would do your job when you're gone? Sorry, I did not mean to advance. So I'll take a minute. If anybody has any questions or comments here, you can drop them in the chat or you can share with us verbally. And then we can move on. So these questions are things you're going to want to ask yourself. You're going to want to ask about the employees who work with you, the elected officials that work with you, the folks who hold the keys, the folks who hold the username and password, the folks who know where the bodies are buried. I've used that metaphor twice today, but these are the folks who these are the questions that help you identify potentially where the gaps are in what your knowledge is. And what Steve says is true. From day one, you start the job, you write these things down, you create a log, you create a record, and so folks know what it is you've done. And it's not necessarily a way to like micromanage, but it's a way to make sure that that job can continue on if you are not in that role anymore. And so for the clerk to be able to log the things that she's doing, for the budget manager to be able to share usernames and passwords and how she processes payments and expenditures, is a good thing for somebody else to know other than that one person. And for some communities where these folks are working out of their home, thinking about records and where those records are kept and who has access to those records is very important. Because once they leave, and they may not necessarily leave on their own volition, you're going to want to make sure somebody has access to those records. So Steve mentioned it in his chat about tacit knowledge. So we've got explicit knowledge and we've got tacit knowledge, right? So we've got explicit knowledge here. And this iceberg shows like the explicit knowledge might just be a tip of the iceberg. It might just be a small shadow of what that person knows about the job that they do. But that tacit knowledge, the ideas, the skills that they have that might be implicit to that person, their education, their expertise, their observations, their relationships with people internal to the organization and people elsewhere. That can be really hard to capture. So there are some methods for transferring that I'm sorry, I'm pausing because I'm looking at the comments at the same time. We can create SOPs that people will, it's time consuming upfront, but it makes the job easier later. Standard operating procedures, writing things down, folks know where things are. We don't have to log every little thing that we do on an hourly basis. But hey, that mechanic who came out and helped us with that pump, he was a good guy, reasonable price. Here's his business card, staple it in the book, write down what he did. And it's there for someone else later. Otherwise, it's a phone call and a service visit that no one else has any record of. So these things can happen, these things should happen along the way. To Taylor's example, yes, these don't necessarily work in case of abrupt departures. But what we're talking about here is developing things today that will help us 5 years from now, maybe 5 months from now, maybe a year from now. But developing things today, putting processes in place today that will help us in the future. Because there's no easy solution. There's no good solution to Susan left yesterday and I don't know what to do. So in places where you've got a planned departure, overlapping positions, having someone stay for a few months to train up their replacement, that would be great. We also have to work with our elected officials to budget that, but it's possible and it's a good idea. Creating desk manuals, and we don't have to write that today. We can do it bit by bit, piece by piece, working with the folks who designed our utility to get us some of the information that we need, and other folks to put those manuals together. Hopefully you can see this, my phone, right? We can take pictures and video in ways that 12-year-old Chris Dodson could never imagine. We can take pictures and videos of processes, of business cards, of maps, and share them and store them in ways that we never could before. That valve over there, it works pretty weird. and you have to kind of jiggle it in this way. Well, no one's going to know that other than the guy who exercises that valve. But if he takes a video on his phone and he shares it with folks, all of a sudden, other folks know how to jiggle that valve in a way, exercise that valve in a way that will make it do what it needs to do. Interviews, I think sometimes just taking the time to sit down with folks and say, so what is it that you do? What do I need to know about your job? This isn't threatening. I'm not here to try to replace you. I'm here to make sure that I understand that if tomorrow you get hit by a bus, we can keep on keeping on. And we want to do that for the betterment of the town or the village or the utility, for the betterment of the taxpayers. If I don't have information that I need to do the job for the person who just left, that's a waste of taxpayer dollars. I'm spending my time figuring things out that I could have learned months ago. Work teams, especially in DPW and maybe in some utilities where you've got folks who are working together so that they know what the other guy does and can essentially fill in if that person leaves. And then job shadowing, again, similar to overlapping positions. Like, you want to train somebody up, follow this guy around for a while. A lot of towns and villages have clerks and assistant clerks, and that's for a reason. Because if the clerk leaves, the assistant clerk should be able to step up and work in that role. And so for a lot of our other jobs, it shouldn't necessarily be much different. So just kind of an infographic quickly of documentation, videos, photos, maps, manuals, GIS, which is essentially the same thing as maps, as-built drawings, but you want to make sure that they're accurate and up to date, system diagrams, notepads, and then policy guides. What did elected officials decide to do about activity X? And our staff briefed on that, and do they know how to operate under that policy? We can also do it through training and development. Send folks out to conferences, to day-long trainings, to webinars like this, where they can learn from folks like me, and also potentially get mentoring and work with folks who are their peers in kind of interagency, peer-to-peer kind of discussions. And there's a lot of different things that can happen online these days, especially because of COVID. It's kind of allowed us all to act in the way that we're acting now. And then different processes and practices. What does the day-to-day look like for your DPW, for your clerk, for your water or your wastewater utility? Like, what does that person do? And we don't have to name them, but they show up at 7 and they do certain things until 3 and then they leave. What is that list of things? We should be able to know those. You should be able to know those. It should also not be a threat to the guy who does that job today that you know those things. What does regulation require? Testing, lab work, etc. And then what are some of the technological advances that might not exist today? And this is a great thing about knowledge transfer. I might learn that you do something a certain way, and then I realize that you've been doing that thing a certain way since 1985, and the year is 2023, and there is a more efficient way to do that thing. I've got colleagues who still take spreadsheets off of the internet. They download them, they print them, and then they type them back in to a different database. That's inefficient. It's also 1985. In 1985, my teacher was printing dittos on a machine, and she'd get her fingers all purple, and it would smell like chemicals from all the dittos she was printing for us. Technology changes, but people don't always necessarily change with it. And so, without being threatening, looking at the way people do things and looking for improvement, for efficiency, but also for the benefit of folks who might come in and replace them. So a few more minutes, I just want to share with you a document that we created together with the Tug Hill Commission on position knowledge inventory. This is, so the next few slides are essentially the 4 pages of that document broken up. And so this might help you, help the folks you work with identify the information you might want to capture for the good of your government, for the good of your community or utility or department. So this is the beginning of the first page. In what ways does your job help carry out the mission of the utility? This also is a great kind of evaluation tool because it gets people to think about, gee whiz, where do I fit into this puzzle? And am I doing on the day-to-day what I thought I would do or what these folks are expecting of me? And again, it shouldn't be threatening because maybe we've got folks in roles that we did not define well, or they did not understand well, or they fell into and it's not working out. And so we might have a capacity issue, and this might be a way to figure that out. So some questions for folks if they were to fill this out, like what are your critical responsibilities and activities? There's probably some aspects of your job that only you know. So if you left your position today, what wouldn't get done because no one else knows how to do it? If you went on vacation and came back 2 weeks from now, what would be there waiting for you? If you're on vacation and someone doesn't know something, who's going to call you on vacation or text you on vacation? And what is it going to be they're texting you for? And then if you're a supervisor, the people that report to you, what do they need from you to do their job on the daily? If I love this question of if I went on vacation to a remote island and had no email, no phone, what are the things that people are going to wish they knew? And what are the things that are going to be on my desk when I return? I think this is one of the key questions to knowledge transfer. Because nobody wants to be put in a position of answering a phone call on their vacation, and nobody wants to put in the position of sitting on their hands, sweating, waiting for someone to come back from vacation because they need to do something and they don't know how. So then what information or experience would someone need to do what you do when you're gone, on vacation, on retirement, hit by a bus? Like, what do folks need to know to do your job? And again, knowledge is power. To have that knowledge means you've got some authority, you've got some agency, you've got some strength over the people that you work with because you know something that they don't. And that's great, but that's not good for the community or your utility or your department if for some reason you left. And it's also not a good use of taxpayer dollars if the folks who scramble to figure out what you did after you're gone spend time doing that. So what is that knowledge, and where is it stored? So is that knowledge and expertise currently available somewhere? Is it on a Google Drive or on a spreadsheet, or at least in a notebook? If not, then how do we get it there? And then what are the physical assets that are assigned to you? Your computer, the username and password, the filing cabinet, and the keys that go with it. The keys to the front door of the highway barn. Does someone else have those? Do they know where they are if you're not around? Does someone know the username and password? What about the email account? Does someone have the username and password? There have been instances in New York, and I think actually even in the Tug Hill, where folks have created, a town supervisor at gmail.com. And when they got unelected, they took that email account with them. They would not share it, and they started using it as if they were still the supervisor. These are situations that we don't want to be in. Do we have written manuals? Are there instructions? If something happens, if the heater fails, if a pump fails, do we know who to call? Have you provided that list of vendors that the utility or the department or the municipality might want if you're not around and if something fails? Or if you have funding through state and federal agencies, who are the contact points for those folks? Do we have that written down? And yes, Joanna, we do have this online, and I think Avery will share it as a follow-up as well to this email or to this webinar. So just starting to think through some of these questions and like, what is it that I know that someone else should probably know in the case that I go? And if you're the guy on the outside, gee whiz, what does Chris know that I should probably know in case that he goes? And how do I get it from him without making him feel threatened or without making him feel like his power is being taken away from him? That's a pretty hard question, but it's one to start thinking about. So a few more questions. Do you have to go anywhere? If so, where? How often? And to do what? Do you have any documents, financial or budgetary? If you've got state or federal funding, you've probably got a portal that others should probably have access to in case that you leave for one reason or the other. Sorry, we're in a room where the lights go off if you sit still for too long. Apparently we've sit still for too long. But again, if you've got a state loan or grant, there are obligations there in reporting and with transfers of funds. And you might not want to be the only person who owns that responsibility. And folks like me, I don't want to be the only person who owns that responsibility. And if Avery had that responsibility too, it would make me happy. It would make me relieved. And it would also create redundancy in case one of us left for one reason or the other. And then where are the files? So using the example of of state funding, you have to hold on to those files for like 7 to 10 years. Maybe Jen or John or someone knows better than I do, but you have to hold on to these things for a while. Where are they? How are they filed? And how do we get access? And again, if you've got a clerk, like many towns do, working from home, and these things are in their basement, that's a vulnerability that the town or the village should figure out how to overcome. It's not a bad thing. It just makes the community vulnerable. All right, so that's it. For those of you who are old enough to recognize this, that's all, folks. This is my email. This is my name. This is the Environmental Finance Center. We can open it up now we've got about 10 minutes if anybody's got any questions. Avery and I have been trying to manage through the chat, but that doesn't mean that we've been perfect at it. So if there are questions or comments in the chat that we missed, then let us know now.
And I just want to reiterate that I'm getting some questions about the slides and recording, and we will still be setting those out after the session. We might need a couple days, but we will make sure that you get all the materials referenced today, including the position knowledge inventory that Chris showed at the end of his presentation.
Jen, John, anything to add?
Just a huge thank you to you, and thank you for people putting their comments and questions in the chat. I've been reading them as we're going along, but no, really thanks for being here for us to help us with this issue.
Yes, I agree. I'm hoping the webinar starts a conversation in a lot of our municipalities where, you know, I think the big thing is actually taking the action and making sure that what you know is known by more than just you. So I hope this starts more than just the conversation with some of our communities.
Right, and thank you, Angie, for the reminder. If we could take a second to say Chris is making an appearance at our local government conference,
Yep.
April 6th at Turning Stone. We'll be giving this presentation, so if you want to hear more and want to send your friends our way, head on over to our website, tughill.org, to find out more about the local government conference.
And I'll actually be talking twice that day, once
That's
on
right.
this and once on funding.
That's right.
And in case you're interested, this will be not necessarily the same presentation, so you will learn new things then too. Well, thank you, everybody. If there's no more questions, I think we can probably adjourn a few minutes early. Thanks, Jen and John, for working with Avery and I here at the Environmental Finance Center for making this happen. We will share the document for folks who might want to use it. The Environmental Finance Center, I neglected to say at the top of the call, like, we provide technical assistance on things like this all day long. So we do managerial and financial technical assistance for local government and water and wastewater utilities. And this falls right into our wheelhouse. So if you want us to come out and start thinking about ways to start documenting some of the information that you have on site, or any of the other related topics, we're happy to do it. Just send me a note. And yeah, hopefully I'll see some of you at the conference on April 6th. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jen and John, for co-hosting this with us. And thanks, Avery, for providing technical assistance. And thanks, everybody, for participating, and have a good night.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone.